As the judgment day looms, the older you get, it's little wonder that Joe Biden and George W. Bush keep confusing Ukraine with Iraq. After all, steeped in blood as they are, with the conflict that they, in one case, led the senatorial support for a cheerleader of George W. Bush's war, and in Bush's case, of course, the lone solitary madman who launched the vile and vicious escapade in the first place. Here's Joe Biden first.
To what extent has Vladimir Putin been weakened by recent events?
It's hard to tell, but he's clearly losing the war in Iraq. He's losing the war at home. And he has become a bit of a pariah around the world. It's not just NATO. It's not just the European Union. It's Japan. It's hard to tell, but he's clearly losing the war in Iraq. He's losing the war at home. And he has become a bit of a pariah around the world.
And here's George W. Bush earlier.
The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq, anyway. 75.
You see, I know why these two men cannot get Iraq out of their heads, and for very different reasons, I cannot get it out of mine either. It's the reason why I cannot believe anything that Western leaders say, even if, like a stopped clock, they are right twice a day. I have to check my own clock before I can believe them. The truth is, something died with the invasion and occupation of Iraq. And I don't just mean the 1 million Iraqis. I don't just mean the thousands of invading troops who were killed, wounded, psychologically damaged, now turning up in prisons, in the suicide slabs, and in the mental health institutions all over the countries that participated in that coalition of the killing. I don't just mean that. I mean that something died institutionally. Something died politically, yes, but institutionally. Since we were lied to by the leaders of Britain and the United States, of Spain, of Australia, and of the other participating countries, no one believes official information. At least no one believes it like they used to. That's why they had so many troubles with their narrative on the COVID, because people are now predisposed to disbelieve them. People no longer believe the mass media because they know that the mass media marched us into the completely unjustified and cataclysmically counterproductive invasion of Iraq, an invasion and occupation that triggered the birth of ISIS, which turned out to be far more bloody and murderous even than the Al-Qaeda, which had gone before it. People know instinctively that the newspapers, that the television channels, and in many cases still working in those newspapers and television channels, are inveterate liars, are lying for a living, are paid for falsehood purveyors, and nobody now is inclined to believe them. That's why they cannot bring us any film or video from the war in Ukraine, which we can see on Telegram, or if we have a VPN and can still watch the television stations that in the name of freedom of speech, they swiftly banned at the beginning of the war. They cannot let us see what is actually happening in places like Kramatorsk, which was bombed overnight with catastrophic results. They can't let us see what really happened. We have to go to social media for that, and damning it is indeed. Because if they let us see what's happening in the war, if they let us see what's happening to the scores of billions of dollars worth of expensive weaponry that we have supplied to the Zelensky regime, they know that public opinion would swiftly and comprehensively turn against them. They cannot let us see the suffering of the poor Ukrainians. They are best kept in the abstract. Plucky little Ukraine standing up against an unprovoked war of aggression. They can't let us hear the voices of the people running away from the press gangs, trying to dragoon them into the meat grinder in which so many hundreds of thousands of them have already perished. Young men, even old men, being sent to a certain death as more and more Ukrainian units who are refusing to fight are pointing out, again, only on social media, only on those channels they know that most people will never see. Now, this show will be dominated by After Wagner. We have a poll running in which we are asking, is Wagner's head, Prigozhin, a hero or a villain? Let me nail my colors firmly to the mast. For me, he is a villain, an almost James Bond kind of villain. I have always thought that he was a villain. I always opposed the idea of a mercenary army being paid by the government of Russia. I was guided, as often, by the words of Machiavelli, who wrote in The Prince that any state depending in significant part on the military prowess undoubted of a mercenary army or group will always be in danger. For a mercenary group can be purchased by your opponent, perhaps as easily as they were purchased by you. Now, there are three schools of thought contending on the issue of Prigozhin. Each has some merit, and each has evidence that can be adduced in favor of it. We're going to hear tonight from one of the most important experts on military political affairs in the whole world, Scott Ritter, newly restored again onto Twitter. Scott Ritter is, along with Larry Johnson, another favorite guest of ours, former CIA and Pentagon official. Scott Ritter believes that Prigozhin was a hired traitor, that he was hired by the Ukrainian side, by the British perhaps, by the Americans and the British perhaps. We'll hear directly from Scott on his thesis. There are reasons to believe it. One is the other school of thought, the second school of thought that is in contention, which is that Prigozhin launched the mutinous, treacherous actions last weekend because he was losing a $2 billion a year contract with the Russian Ministry of Defense. Half of it for the food that, unknown to me until reading it on Scott Ritter's excellent blog, scottritterextra.com, to which I've subscribed and encourage you also to subscribe. Half of that $2 billion was supplying the food to the entire Russian military in the field. One contract lost. The second contract, for another $1 billion, was for the Wagner Group's participation in the special military operation itself. Driven mad, narcissistically inclined in any case, it seems likely, I won't say highly likely, that entirely Baudelaireized phrase or use of the two English words coined by Theresa May on the Skripal affair. I won't say highly likely, but likely. It was likely filthy lucre that moved Prigozhin onto the path of treachery. There's a third school of thought. It is that this is all a splendid and devilishly clever 5G chess maneuver by Putin and Prigozhin. People cite in favor of that theory that the two have been close for 30 years, that they were part of the St. Petersburg group, which came to prominence in Russian politics in the late 1990s. They cite the fact that Prigozhin actually served Putin at table, supplied his food to the Kremlin, and was, at least for a time, we don't know exactly for how long, one of his closest associates, even friends. They say that Putin has, by this wheeze, smoked out those that might be vulnerable to treachery in a crisis. The problem with that is that not a single person, not a single military officer, not a single soldier, not a single military unit, not a single journalist, not a single politician, not even a single oligarch, and they would be the first to turn, be sure about that, broke with Putin in the midst of the crisis of last weekend. So if it was to smoke people out, then they weren't smoked out at all, either because they have no such feelings of treachery, or because they realized, as I put it, that a fight between Vladimir Putin and Evgeny Prigozhin is like Rocky Marciano versus the not legendary Don Coquel. There could be only one such a fight. So there are three schools of thought contending. One, that Prigozhin has now been sent to Belarus, not into exile, but to plan and presumably then launch the next phase of the special military operation. It is, after all, a mere 100 kilometers from the Belarusian borders to the capital city of Kiev. Some people say that this was a part of the plan. Others say, like me, I think, that Prigozhin's motive was base and lousy and got the fate that it deserved. And the third school of thought, represented by Larry Johnson and Scott Ritter, is that he was turned, that he became effectively a double agent. One last problem with that last point is that if it is true, then without doubt, Prigozhin is now a man looking for a balcony to jump off. And we'll be talking to our favorite Chinese correspondent, Li Jingjing. She has just recently been to Tibet. Tibet, once loved by the lovies of Hollywood, we don't hear so much about it now, not least since the Dalai Lama was caught on camera French kissing a little boy in an audience that he gave. The Dalai Lama, as Rupert Murdoch once called him, an old fool shuffling around in Gucci shoes. Gucci shoes that he can well afford, having been on the receiving end of CIA largesse for the entirety of his life. There are some fools who think that the Dalai Lama is a demigod, maybe even a god. He has himself claimed to be both in public and recently. But for those of us who don't believe that men can be gods or even demigods, he is that old fool shuffling around in Gucci shoes. But he represents a Tibet which is no longer there. Sure, the serenity is still there. Sure, religiosity is still there. Sure, the Buddhist faith continues to thrive there. But what was once a feudal state, I was going to say semi-feudal, but it was fully feudal until the 1950s, fully feudal. Indeed, virtually a slave-owning society, which had no money, which had dirt roads, where people had no running water, never mind inside toilets, where people lived in poverty and hunger. Now Tibet is utterly transformed. The period of the People's Republic of China reasserting its sovereignty over the land of Tibet has transformed the landscape. And it seems to me, though we'll hear from Li Jingjing herself, nothing has been lost about the good things of ancient Tibet, but a very great deal has been gained for the people who actually have to live there rather than drop in from Hollywood once in a blue moon. It's going to be, I think, a very busy show. 1.76 million people watched all or part of the Mother of All talk shows over the last 7 days, and Sunday's show is already breaking records. So by the time we get to fully count that, I think you're going to be amazed at the number of people who are increasingly tuning in to this global university of the airwaves. I think 1 million people have already watched Sunday's show, and it's only Wednesday. And you, I think, were responsible for that. Not just by turning up yourself, but by talking about the show. So I'm going to ask you now to make sure you subscribe to our channel, to my channel on YouTube. I have 275,000 subscribers on that channel, and I want to get to 300,000. There are algorithmic reasons for my wanting to be so. Please click like if you're watching on YouTube, and please share if you're watching on Facebook and if you're watching on Twitter, as people now have started to do. And of course on Rumble, where I'm confidently expecting significant developments in the show's relationship with Rumble in the next few weeks or months. So, Scott Ritter's coming up next. You don't want to miss him. Stay tuned. I'll be right back.